1942, Andre Breton wrote one of the first articles about Marcel Duchamp, who he considered to be one of the most brilliant men of his generation. And he was quite dismayed to discover that Duchamp spent the vast majority of his time playing chess. And we've all touched on this a little bit. I think we can officially declare him the patron saint of this conference. But I don't think that this is a trivial fact. Breton saw it as a distraction, and he couldn't piece together the relationship between Duchamp's gamer persona, if you will, and his artist persona. One thing I found in doing research on this subject was that the vast majority of photographs of Marcel Duchamp, in fact, feature him playing chess. The top one is him playing chess with Man Ray. But Antoinette Lafarge from UC Irvine has argued in the catalog for the Shift Control exhibition, one of the first game art exhibitions in the country, that Duchamp's entire art practice was in fact a game, that he treated all of his movements as an artist as movements in a giant strategic chess game with the art world, the art community, and the art medium. This is his famous Nude Descending a Staircase, perhaps his best-known painting. A couple of people have shown this painting as well, and I showed this in lectures for quite a while, and then I learned something really interesting about it, that this painting was done cross-eyed. So in addition to painting on a subject that he loved, he also treated the actual painting of the subject as a game. So I want to talk first about this idea of play as an art medium. And this quote that I gave from Antoinette Lafarge is reinforced by Duchamp's own words, that art is that little game that men have always played with one another. One of the things he did to make a living was carve chess pieces, which I think is very interesting, as did a number of his contemporaries. Interestingly, for anybody who's a fan of chess history, a number of these more modernist chess sets resemble the Islamic chess sets of the 1500s, which were non-representational. But one of the things Marcel Duchamp did do, and I would argue with Jay that I don't think that La Fontaine lacks craft. In fact, I think the selection of the urinal and the orientation of it in orthogonal to its function, because as you can see, it's composition of the broken areas, that he decided to keep it as it was and exhibit it in its broken state. And these are two examples that I think are really interesting about Duchamp's sort of game-like approach to art. The door on the right, on the left, is an actual door in an apartment, which if you look closely, you will see is hinged such that it can close one of two doorways. So it basically flips back and forth. And that was actually in an apartment that was used and lived in. The other is a piece that was never built, but of which he wrote a very elaborate description. And it has been installed. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art as part of the Duchamp collection there. It was built, but it's not really known whether it was ever intended to be built or if it was simply meant as a script. I'm going to talk a little bit too about some other traditions, and Surrealist Games kind of creates a bridge to that. This is, of course, a whole set of actual games that were played by the Dada artists and Surrealist artists. I actually play these games in my classes at Georgia Tech, where several different people would work together on a piece of art with the constraint that no one could see anything else that the other people were drawing except the edges, so that they can essentially abut their piece of the drawing against the next person's. This game is actually called Exquisite Corpse. And this kind of starts to segue to some other issues too. This is actually the box in a valise, which is a piece that Marcel Duchamp did after he allegedly retired. And why this is kind of interesting is that this is a series of pieces in which he essentially appropriated his own work and created collections of reproductions of various artifacts. And one of the interesting things that begins to happen in the movement I'm going to talk about next is that there is this tremendous tension between mass production and reproduction and the whole idea of the art object. This is a picture that was taken of Marcel Duchamp in a retrospect. I had heard of the Fluxus movement before they came here. Oh, that's lovely. This is one of the most underappreciated game-related art movements. And we're familiar with some of the people, some of the more famous people now, June Pike being one of them. I think that I would argue that although Pike is thought of as a video artist, I sort of think of him more as a game artist, because he was constantly playing with making up rules and constraints for himself. For instance, with his whole series of robots that were constructed entirely out of television sets. And this very famous self-reflexive artwork, TV Buddha. Other famous members of this community were John Cage and David Tudor, who were experimental musicians, and I think they're really interesting to look at. In fact, the whole experimental music practice really helps us out a lot with some of this, because they were very involved in this idea of scores. And of course, the score is a natural part of the music creation process, but this is an example of a John Cage score on the right, which doesn't look like a conventional music score in any way, but what he would do is he would construct a set of rules or constraints whereby a piece would be improvised within these kind of game rules. He would also do things in kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit further about Bernard Suit's great kind of description of a game as the least efficient means of accomplishing tasks. One of the things that Cage did repeatedly was make it harder to do whatever would have been normally easy to do. And this is another thing having to do with craft, right? It would have been much easier for him to just sit at a regular piano and play a normal composition with a typical key. But no, he thought he would try doing it on a toy piano. He also did a number of mods to pianos where he would transform the base technology, and really this kind of speaks back to the whole Jody.org thing of physically manipulating the material functionality of the technology that he was dealing with to essentially see what it would do. And this also allows us to interrogate the conventions that we're familiar with. David Tudor and Cage worked closely. David is more known about the political, and they're kind of on the right side of your diagram, left side. They were involved in a number of kind of art-like protest actions. During more or less the same period as some of these other movements, Alan Capra was briefly mentioned. And Alan Capra's happenings were actually probably more game-like than a lot of other performance art. There was usually a pretty detailed set of instructions, and people would have to follow certain types of rules and constraints as to what they were supposed to do. And these were meant to be participatory. Rather than other sorts of performance practices, the audience was actually supposed to do whatever it was that the instructions called for. Another example, though I wouldn't call it an art movement per se, but I think is a related practice, is the New Games movement. And this has been actually very influential on a number of game artists and avant-garde game designers, if I can adopt your terminology. It was originally started by Stuart Grant and some other people, and Bernie DeCoven, who was one of the leaders of the movement, and kind of kept it going and still does workshops. This is actually these are some shots, not that one, because I couldn't find a parachute, but did anyone here ever play with a parachute in elementary school? Yeah. Okay, well that's where that came from, is this movement. And these games actually turned into things like theater games and team building games and things we do in school. A couple of examples, actually. The two here are really great. I usually play these with my students every year. The middle one is the lap game, where everybody sits in a circle and sits down on each other's laps. And the bottom one is the knot game, where everyone holds hands with everyone else in a totally chaotic fashion and then tries to unwrap it into a circle. Ian, why are you covering your face? You don't like new games? There's a couple of other examples. You're doing a new game? So this is rock, paper, scissors, tag. But USC actually has been one of the instrumental places in kind of reviving this, and they taught me how to do it, and now I teach my students how to do it. Some examples of new forms that have come out of this. This is a card game that was developed by students who had done the New Games exercises with Tracy Fullerton's class. This is a giant playing card game. And one of the things that was really interesting about this was that by adding this new rule, this new constraint of scaling of the card size, they didn't do anything else. They didn't make up any new game mechanics, but the scale change completely changed the dynamics of actually playing any of the games. They played a whole series of conventional card games with this new scale variable and radically changed the game mechanics as a result. This is a project that Frank did with his students called Back Manhattan. It's very famous kind of as one of the first big games, but I think it definitely falls into the lineage of some of these other participatory